Hi there. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Amelia Holmes, and I'm excited to introduce you to our speaker. Tamara Plakins Thornton is a professor of history at the State University of New York, Buffalo. She received her bachelor's in the history of science from Harvard and her Ph.D. in American studies from Yale. She is the author of 3 books in American cultural and social history, most recently Nathaniel Bowditch and the Power of Numbers, How a 19th-Century Man of Business, Science, and the Sea Changed American Life. This was published by UNC Press in 2016 and just released in paperback. The book received the John Lyman Book Award from the North American Society for Oceanic History, the Massachusetts Historical Society's Peter J. Gomes Memorial Book Prize, and was a finalist for the New England Society Book Award. Before I turn it over to Tamara, I'd like to give a special shout out thanking Richard M. and Robin Brown Woods for their recent donation of an 1802 first edition of the American Practical Navigator. This volume will now be available to view in the NHA's research library, and I just want to say thank you so much to Richard and Robin. And with that, I'll turn it over now to Tamara.
Thank you so much, Amelia, and thank you, Richard and Robin. What a wonderful gift to the Nantucket Historical Society. I wish I were there in person, speaking to all of you in a room, but I guess we're going back to the 19th century anyway, so we will make do with the usual pandemic Zoom. So who exactly was Nathaniel Bowditch? And if you've heard of Nathaniel Bowditch, it's probably from one of 2 ways. You might have had to read this in grade school, Carry On, Mr. Bowditch. This won a Newbery Medal in the 1950s, so you can't kill it. And maybe you have some idea of how I feel about Carry On, Mr. Bowditch. More likely, because I'm guessing there are a lot of nautical people out there today, it is through Bowditch's Navigator. I'm not lucky enough to have an 1802 first edition, but I have an 1833 one that has been well marked up. It has definitely been at sea. So with that, I'm going to begin to share my screen and show you some images. Okay, so no, he's not just a practical navigator, even though that is certainly the way that he was known. So who was he? Well, he was born in Salem, Massachusetts in 1773. And in his youth, he served as an apprentice clerk in a ship chandlery. And by the time he turned 21, he did what a lot of people, a lot of men in Salem did. They went to the East Indies. Okay, this is the official painting that the East India Marine Society had in their Marine Hall. This was a very elite organization. You had to go beyond the Capes, the Cape of Good Hope or the Cape Horn, as a captain or a supercargo in order to belong to it. Well, Bowditch made that cut. Because starting from the age of 21, and that would be in 1794, he made 5 international trading voyages. He went to Spain, he went to Portugal, but he also went to Indian Ocean islands, he went to the Philippines, he went to Indonesia, and since this is a Nantucket sponsored talk, I have to tell you that when he was in Sumatra in 1799, he recorded in his log that the vessel he was on had encountered a Nantucket vessel named the Eliza, and in his log he wrote, Captain Folger kept company with us this day, said it was very sickly in Batavia, that's Jakarta, that he had buried his supercargo at Angel Point. So he comes back in the early 1800s back to Salem, never to go to sea anymore. And he then develops 3 parallel careers. And one of them, you already know what that career is. This is how he's remembered. This is at his gravesite in Mount Auburn Cemetery. Here he is as the navigator. So we remember him as the new American Practical Navigator. But he also had a second career in science. This is what he did before work, actually, 6 a.m. You would find him doing his astronomy, doing his mathematics. And then he had a third parallel career in business. This was his day job, and he worked in what was a new sector in the American economy, what today we would call the financial industry. Now, I'm going to discuss all three of those careers, but it's important to understand what ties them all together. What lay at the core of all three careers, and really what lay at the core of Bowditch's personality, was his love affair with numbers. And I don't just mean that he was good at them, and he was. In fact, he was damn good at numbers. No, it was more like a religion to him. Numbers were a religion to him, something to believe in, something to be inspired by. And the person who really got what made Bowditch tick and put his finger on it was his minister in Salem, a man named William Bentley, who described how as a young man, Bowditch had kind of dabbled in various types of learning, but Bentley said he found too much of opinion in things like literature and philosophy. But he found in the power of numbers, and that's a quote from Bentley, he found in the power of numbers something certain, something sure. So the power of numbers for Bowditch was that certainty. It was about exactness. It was about predictability. It was about regularity. This is really what makes Bowditch tick. So, and we can see this in all three of his careers. Okay, so let's begin with that Practical Navigator. Here you see it. He published it in 1802 in Newburyport, and by the late 1810s, it became absolutely standard on American vessels. It became indispensable. How indispensable? Well, most of you are familiar with the story of the Nantucket whaler Essex that was destroyed by a whale in 1820. That's the basis for the Moby Dick story. And the survivors salvaged what its first mate, Owen Chase, later described as the probable instruments of our salvation. Now, what were those probable instruments? 2 compasses, 2 quadrants, and to make those things work, 2 copies of Bowditch. So why was this so indispensable? Well, with Bowditch, with the pages in this book, you could locate where you were at sea. You could figure out your latitude and what was much more of a trick, your longitude. So you could plot a course and you could get there safely. And you did this steering by the stars, in other words, through celestial navigation. And in particular, to find your longitude, you used the lunar method of celestial navigation. That lunar method was not easy. Here you have an image of somebody doing the first step of the lunar method, which is to make observations of stars and of the moon with a quadrant. You're recording the angular distance between these celestial objects. Looks easy in a 2-dimensional image, not so much when your vessel is going like this, right? Not so easy. Then you have to take those positions and you have to translate that data, that shipboard data, into your actual latitude and longitude. And to do that was originally, with the lunar method, an hours-long process involving a lot of complicated mathematics, logarithms, trigonometry. But there are shortcuts, and those shortcuts are what you're going to find in the Practical Navigator. One of the things that Bowditch will give you are lots of tables of pre-calculated numbers, nautical tables. That's one input into working lunars in a shorter fashion. And the other is of kind of step-by-step formula where you just plug in the numbers and boom, out comes your latitude and longitude. There's no theory that Bowditch goes into in his book. He just tells you how to do it. You don't need to understand it. You just need to be able to do it. So this is not, you know, the Great British Baking Show. This is kind of the Bisquick version of celestial navigation. That's what makes it indispensable. Now, Often you will hear that Bowditch invented all of this stuff. Well, that's not true. You can find pretty much the same thing, not in the new American Practical Navigator, but in the new Practical Navigator, which was published by an Englishman, John Hamilton Moore. And what Bowditch does is he revises and revises and revises Moore's book until he feels it is ready to issue as his own. Moore also has the lunar method in this, so that's not something Bowditch invented either, but I'm not going to downgrade the American Practical Navigator. It was huge, and the reason it was huge was because of what else? It's numbers, okay? This is just one of the dozens and dozens of tables of numbers that make up most of the new American Practical Navigator. These were numbers, or numbers like this appeared in charts in Moore's Navigator as well. But what Bowditch did was he went through every single number in Moore, and there were tens of thousands of them, and he recalculated them all. And he found 8,000 errors. So Bowditch's numbers were better. They were accurate, right? This is the power of numbers: accuracy, certainty. They were better. And since your cargo relies on this, your life relies on this, who wouldn't want Bowditch, right? Certainly Owen Chase was very happy to have Bowditch after the whale ship was wrecked. So that is Bowditch's first career. And just as a little coda here, those nautical tables that such as you find in Bowditch's Navigator, everybody understood how critical those were. They had to be done absolutely accurately. Charles Babbage, the man who invented what we know as the modern computer, the prototype of the modern computer, invented his difference engine for precisely that task, to calculate nautical tables, because he knew if human error is introduced, watch out, shipwreck. So he invented this. He said, let's do it by steam, okay? But Bowditch would have answered, what's the fun in that? You know, no power of numbers there. So that's Bowditch bringing the power of numbers to his career as the navigator. Now he had a second career, and this is as a scientist. He was an astronomer, a mathematician, and in fact, he considered his navigator what he called a merely practical manual. And he wanted to be part of the international world of science, which at the time meant the European world of science. He wanted to run with the big boys. And frankly, at this time in the early 19th century, America was a complete cultural backwater. We were not on the map. And on top of that, Bowditch was entirely self-taught in astronomy and physics and mathematics. So if we look at his actual output, we're not going to see what we might associate with a European scientist of fame in this era. He published in American newspapers and in American scientific journals, which nobody but Americans read. And in them, he corrected some minor mathematical errors in European works. Remember, he hated bad numbers, but no real scientific import to what that was all about. He also recorded his observations and calculations about the trajectories of comets and eclipses and meteors that could be observed from the New World. So this was a niche for Americans because these are New World observations and calculations. And you know, on the basis of these very modest contributions, he developed quite a huge reputation in the United States. Harvard offered him a faculty position. Then they gave him an honorary degree. Actually, they gave him two. They made him a master's. Then they gave him a doctorate. Thomas Jefferson called him a meteor in the hemisphere of American cultural life. his real accomplishment, his major accomplishment, has to do with this man up here. This is a bust of Pierre Simon Laplace, a Frenchman who wrote this book, or books, because there are really several volumes, at the turn of the 19th century, the Mécanique Céleste. And what the Mécanique Céleste was the culmination of all the physical sciences, physics, mathematics, astronomy, since Newton, both in Britain and on the continent. This was a magisterial work, okay? It was really the masterwork of Enlightenment science. And once Bowditch got a hold of this, he was enthralled, and it became his dream to translate it into English, which he did, and also annotated it, making it quite a bit longer. The annotation explained what was going on. So why was he so enthralled with this? Well, here's a man who has an almost spiritual devotion to all the qualities associated with numbers, right? Exactness, certainty, predictability. And this is what Laplace is all about. And so Laplace was a revelation. It became Bowditch's Bible, really. The Laplacian vision of the solar system is of a self-regulating, rule-bound universe that is predictable, it is regular, it is acting according to mathematical laws. It is essentially a clockwork mechanism, like this orrery that illustrates the workings of the solar system, except it's actually better because it never needs fixing, it never needs winding. So this becomes Bowditch's Bible, this Laplace and this Laplacian vision. And this is, interestingly enough, what he brings to his third career, which takes place partly in Salem, when he is the head of a marine insurance company between 1804 to 1823, and even more so when he moves to Boston, to the financial district. Here we have State Street in Boston in 1837, and one of these buildings, I still don't know which one it is the company that he worked for, which was at its time the largest financial institution in New England. It had the word insurance in its official title, but it had nothing to do with insurance really, or very little anyway. What it really was a trust and investment company. In fact, it was the very first trust and investment company in the United States. It took all of that Brahmin money in from the Lowells and the Cabots, it put it in trust, something new, and then that money was then reinvested in things like the Lowell textile mills. So what happens when you take a Laplacian scientist who is smitten with numbers and system, and you ask him to run an institution? Well, he turns that institution into a Laplacian clockwork mechanism. In fact, he turned all the institutions he controlled into clockwork mechanisms. That included business corporations, but also things like the East India Marine Society and its museum, now the Peabody Essex, the Boston Athenaeum, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and then, biggest of all, when he was an overseer and a member of the corporation, Harvard University. So what do I mean by a clockwork mechanism? And in order to understand what I mean by that, you really have to see the before picture. Because in this era, institutions, including major corporations, ran in a surprisingly informal way. Okay, they had double entry bookkeeping, they had legal contracts for sure, but a lot of business was a matter of invoices and receipts that were handwritten on random scraps of paper, paperwork that was stored willy-nilly in bundles and boxes, lots of important information that was stored here in people's heads, and plenty of verbal agreements. And that is not a clockwork mechanism, and it was not going to sit well with Dr. Bowditch. One Bostonian described Bowditch this way. He said, "Dr. Bowditch was a man of great order and system. He could not tolerate anything like negligence or irregularity. He doubtless had himself acquired this habit from the nature of his favorite study, mathematics, which is peculiarly suited to form habits of exactness and precision." Very true, okay? So let's take a look at these habits of exactness and precision. And again, I'm going to start with a before picture when I look first at just general business conduct. So here's an example of a before picture. If you go to Newburyport and you look at a company called the Union Marine and Fire Insurance Company. So this company in 1816 discovered that, wow, they were missing a whole lot of money. There was no fraud, but there was such a mess. They had to bring in outside auditors. And what those auditors found would certainly have given Bowditch a headache. Things like unrecorded transactions, a money chest that had no lock on it. The secretary of the company was mixing his private papers with the company papers. And in fact, he was mixing his own money with the company's money. It was impossible to reconstruct what actually happened or to estimate the amount of missing money. Now, compare this to what Bowditch did on State Street, okay? He personally balanced the cash account every day at 2 p.m. sharp. Every December, he closed the office, he reviewed every document, he accounted for every penny, he calculated the profits and losses, and he issued an annual audit. Then he went over to the Boston Athenaeum. He did an annual audit there because he wanted to find all the books that were missing from the library and had been mutilated. And so he did. And while he was at that, he also discovered that the librarian had been mixing the Athenaeum's collection of ancient coins with his own personal collection, just like in Newburyport. And it was completely unclear who had paid for what and what belonged to whom, okay? So this is not a clockwork mechanism, nor is this kind of thing, right? An order among two or between two international, very wealthy merchants placed in 1796, handwritten on a scrap of paper. And this practice doesn't go anywhere away soon. Here you see the same thing in 1821. Bowditch can't tolerate this. The first thing he does when he comes into the corporation in Boston is to have printed blank forms printed up. Okay, printed blank forms. And he says, for example, if you are going to apply for a loan from our company, it must be on one of these forms or else. And around that time, he writes in a letter that he had gotten a loan that was, and here I'm quoting, very badly written on a little nasty piece of paper. And it was so nasty that he was actually tempted to deny the loan. So that is one of Bowditch's calling cards, a printed blank form. I could give you 100 examples. I'm just going to stick with this one. And I'm going to move on to another one of his calling cards, which has to do with the organization of information. What organization, say 18th century businessmen? This is organization. You know, you put stuff in different pigeonholes, or you put it on a spindle on a desk, or you put them in boxes, whatever. There are no file cabinets. There's not even a paper clip in this era. Well, this isn't going to sit well with Bowditch. This is one of the things that he does here. He numbers. He insists that every loan be numbered. So here we have an example, number 762, and he tells all his agents, whenever you write me about number 762, I want it on a paper that has been numbered 762 on the outside. No other loans discussed in this letter. Then I can bundle up all the 762s and keep them together. It's essentially a file system decade before you have filing systems. And these numbering systems you find everywhere Bowditch is, okay? He goes to what is now the Peabody Essex Museum. He sees these fabulous collections, but they're all higgledy-piggledy. He goes through and he literally draws numbers on them. And then he puts together a catalog numbered by item. It seems like a no-brainer to us now. Yeah, now, but not back then. He does the same thing with the Boston Athenaeum. He numbers every library shelf. He marks every book with its shelf number, and then he issues a new catalog arranged by shelf. When he gets to Harvard, oh my, what a mess he finds there. Okay? And he is able to discover that it's the people at the top who are at fault. The president, the treasurer, the number 3, the steward. They have been mixing their own money with Harvard's money. They have been keeping incomplete records, including the minutes of the corporation. Which ones they keep are on little scraps of paper stored here and there. There are overpayments, unauthorized payments, payments with no receipts. And Bowditch goes on a kind of no-holds-barred campaign. He forces the steward out. He forces the treasurer out. He forces President Kirkland out with a lot of strong-arm tactics. This is a huge brouhaha in the Boston, Cambridge area. They recognize that these officers had been at fault, but this is a very ungentlemanly thing to do. So now, of course, we take things like blank forms and numbering systems for granted. You know, this is the way modern life works, in impersonal bureaucracy, right? Printed forms, numbering systems. In some ways, this is the essence of modern life. But where did modern life come from? It doesn't just drop from the sky. People have to make it. And Bowditch is one of the people who makes modern life. Now, he doesn't set out to make modernity. Instead, he's simply acting on his personality, on his thraldom with the power of numbers. He's just following his mathematical instincts to numerate, to paginate, to alphabetize, standardize, organize, methodize, systematize. That is Bowditch. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that Bowditch was an automaton, because he was anything but an automaton. He had a really interesting personality. He was quite prickly. He was quite self-righteous. On the other hand, in his voyages around the world, he was a very curious, interested traveler. He was an over-anxious father, particularly when his son got in trouble with Harvard. He grieved the death of another son. He grieved the death of his wife. He was quite a romantic husband, actually. His best friends were not other mathematicians. One of his best friends was a scholar of languages. Another was a blue-stocking spinster. And he was known to dance around the study when he had successfully calculated a mathematical problem. So he's just an interesting character. But let's not remember him just as a navigator. Let's remember how he suffuses our world today. Where does he suffuse our world? Well, let's go to the catalog of the Nantucket Historical Society. And here we find a call number. Soon a new one will be assigned to this first edition. This is in the footsteps of Bowditch. And when you signed up for this talk today, guess what you did? You filled out a blank form. Oh, Bowditch is smiling there. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation of Bowditch. I'm really looking forward to answering your questions about this fascinating man. Thanks so much.
Oh wow, Tamara, that was that was amazing. So, as someone who has both a nautical background and is a librarian today, like I think I'm a newfound passion for Bowditch that I didn't even know I needed in my life. And I particularly love how you compared the Practical Navigator to as the Bisquick of celestial navigation. I've like written that one down for later. So while we wait for our questions to come in, I wanted to start out with like, so what is it that led you to Bowditch? I mean, he's obviously a fascinating person, but how did you get here?
Yeah, well, I had done work on the Boston elite before. My first book was about the Boston elite. After my second book, I kind of missed dealing with real people. And I was looking for a biographical approach. I knew these Bostonians. I was poking around, and I poked around to look into Bowditch's life. First, I was rather discouraged because I read that he had burned a lot of his personal papers, which is true, but I wasn't daunted. I thought, okay, I'll go see some other papers. And actually, I went to see his business papers at the Harvard Business School's Baker Library. I expected these would be dull, but oh, they were anything but, you know. I think actually it was the little nasty piece of paper that pulled me in. It just exuded his personality. And I thought, you know, I came here thinking this would be dull, and instead it's interesting. And I'm finding out all kinds of things that I had not expected. And I put that together with, well, how does this fit in with the Navigator? And how does it fit in with his scientific work? So his life presented a lot of conundrums to me. And along with that kind of peppery personality that kept me going until I really saw that common thread of the power of numbers. And then that kind of warp speeded me into his larger significance for American society.
Well, that's awesome. And I really appreciate, obviously, that you have chosen to share that with us through your book. It's really, it's just, I feel like such a niche thing in a way, but then based on like our audience tonight, there's obviously like a passion for kind of understanding him a little better. So we've had a couple of questions come in. And so two people have asked the same question, which I think you'll know the answer to. So did he do numbering in libraries before the Dewey Decimal System? And did he have kind of any relationship or like overlap with the Dewey Decimal System?
He was doing this way before the Dewey Decimal System. Dewey he's working at the end of the 1800s. But he is in turn inspired by a bunch of librarians at Harvard, who in turn had been inspired by the librarian that Bowditch, sitting on the corporation of Harvard, had put in place and had said, go to it, put together what was then called a scientific card catalog. Because before this, there were catalogs of Harvard's collections, for example, but they were alphabetical. They didn't tell you where anything was. There were no numbers. Sometimes they were put together by donor. Sometimes the library itself would be arranged by donor. So here are all the books Jones gave, here are all the books that Smith gave. So Bowditch really was using some ideas that he had gotten from Germany as well. So he's not entirely original, but he's very much the one who brings energy to the numbering, cataloging project to museums and libraries in America. So he's the one that really gives this energy in the 1820s already. And Dewey is a descendant of him, but a descendant many decades down the line.
That's great, thank you. Do you know of a connection between Bowditch and Benjamin Franklin, since Franklin was working on the Gulf, like was his work on the Gulf Stream influenced by Bowditch's work at all?
No, it wasn't. And one thing that's really interesting about Benjamin Franklin, he was a fantastic experimentalist, and he developed a truly international reputation based on his original idea. But he could not do math. He could not do math. So, for example, he could read Newton's optics, but he couldn't read Newton's Principia. So the kind of stuff that Bowditch was up to, Franklin would not have been able to understand. And Bowditch also is considerably later, so he is not actually working until, publishing until the early 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century. So there's a gap in time. There's also a gap in skill. And unfortunately for Bowditch, there's also a gap in reputation, international reputation.
So another follow-up question about relationships. Would you have had any relationship with Maria Mitchell, who was also, obviously also working with the stars?
Right. Okay. So she comes too late.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he had some relationship with Walter Folger, who's another person from Nantucket.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I think he's the person who made the astronomical clock.
That's right.
In the collections. So this is a type okay? A person in this era in the 18th, early 19th century, historians call them mathematical practitioners. They can do all kinds of stuff. They can make almanacs, they can make clocks, they can make orreries, they can do surveying, they can do navigation. They have their handle on all of these kinds of mathematical skills, not calculus, okay, that's beyond them. But there are these types of people, and Folger was one of them. So he's a correspondent of Bowditch. When Bowditch publishes his material on comets, for example, he gets data from Walter Folger, which you can take as a big compliment, because Bowditch did not want junk data. He didn't trust just anybody. He had to believe you knew that you were up to. His reputation was on the line, and he didn't want to mix his superb data with the junk data. So that's the Bowditch seal of approval on Walter Folger, but unfortunately not a connection with Maria Mitchell.
Great, thank you. Could you say a bit about how Bowditch came to compile his 1806 chart of the harbors of Salem, Marblehead, Beverly, etc.?
Right. Okay, so he got a job doing this work. There had been a Massachusetts piece of legislation passed that everybody had to redo their charts, and Bowditch got involved in this survey. And of course, he felt that he was doing a better job at it. So this was his contribution to that project. And you better believe that you could count on its numbers.
Excellent, thank you. So we've had, I feel like this is kind of a fun one that's come in. So this questioner has said that Bowditch is one of her personal heroes and says, thank you for this talk. But do you think if he was born 200 years later, what kind of role would he have now? Would it be finance, economics? Would he be in computers, something else? I don't know if you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, no, I think he'd be a software engineer. I think he would absolutely love Babbage's descendants, right? I think he'd be completely enthralled with computers. Whether he would come up with something new, probably not, and he knew this about himself, actually, when he was on his deathbed, when, people tend to confront their lives. He admitted, he said, I'm really of a second rank. I'm not of a first rank. He understood that about himself. On the other hand, he was not saying he was third or fourth or fifth, which is probably somewhat closer to the truth as a mathematician. So he felt pretty good about being in the second rank, but he did recognize that he was not a genius at mathematics. But I'm sure this is what he would have done.
Great. Well, I mean, yeah, it's interesting to imagine, and I guess at least there's like a little bit of humility there, like at least there's some on his deathbed. So do you, yeah. So this is a great question. So can you just talk a little bit about the American Practical Navigator? What practical applications does it have for mariners today?
Well, the American Practical Navigator, as it's issued today, does not look not a thing like the 1802 version. It's still called Bowditch. People still refer to it as Bowditch. There's a section in it known as the historical section that gives a little biography of Bowditch that is actually quite inaccurate, unfortunately, and makes claims for Bowditch's originality that just don't hold water. The rest of it, though, I mean, most of Bowditch is stuff that no longer applies. Most of the Bowditch book was about celestial navigation. And that's, that has long been superseded. It was superseded by chronometers, which actually coexisted with celestial navigation. But for Americans, it was frankly too expensive. Those were expensive things, those chronometers. But by the 19th century, American vessels are carrying chronometers. Then you have Loran, now you have GPS. I've given talks before where I've had people from Coast Guard and the Navy talk to me afterwards, and they said, oh, we're actually kind of going back to celestial navigation. It's a great backup. You know, what happens if there's some kind of hacking of GPS? We got to be able to go back and do celestial navigation. But if you look in the modern practical navigator, it doesn't have the kinds of stuff that would have been in Bowditch's Navigator. So his name is in many ways, it's a salute to Bowditch in the same way that the Navy has a vessel, the USS Bowditch, which is a research vessel. That's very nice. There's a Bowditch Hall. I think that's might be the Merchant Marine Academy, or it might be the Naval Academy. Probably someone in the audience knows. These are all very nice, but the today's American Practical Navigator, although it is required, it is still required on every single vessel in the United States Navy. It actually doesn't bear any relation to what Bowditch produced in 1802, or even in the other editions that he produced in his lifetime.
Interesting, thank you. So could you talk a little bit about, before Bowditch and his accurate numbers, was it not possible to calculate longitude?
Well, before Bowditch, it was possible, but Bowditch, the individual, it's around the time of the American Revolution that you get these two methods to establish longitude. And one is the chronometer. A lot of the listeners will know about the Harrison chronometer. They'll know Davis Sobel's book, Longitude, which, of course, makes me angry because it gives all the glory to the chronometer, but there was also the lunar method, which worked equally well. Okay, so you have these two methods, you have them in place really by around the 1770s when Bowditch is born. Okay, so Bowditch learned the lunar method as a young man. He didn't invent it, so it was there. Before that, though, there was no way to accurately establish your longitude, and it did lead to a lot of shipwrecks. So what a lot of Americans did, and Europeans as well, let's say you're an American, from Nantucket, you want to sail across to Europe. What you do is you sail down the coast until you hit the latitude that you want to hit when you're in Europe, and then you sail straight across. So you basically do this, okay, instead of this, because you can't tell where you are in the middle of the sea. So you're just kind of going to go straight west and wait till you hit Europe and hope that you don't run into it.
Cool. Yeah, I feel like I find this all to be so amazing, especially now with where we do rely so heavily on GPS, and what you're saying about this like potential just having celestial navigation as a backup. I mean, all of that is just so like very foreign to me in a way, and I just find that to be fascinating.
You know, it's fascinating to me reading Bowditch's logs. There he is, he's going, you know, across the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope. He's threading his way through all these islands in the Indian Ocean, looking for a speck. And damn if they don't hit the speck. And they don't hit those islands. It's pretty astounding that it depends on making good observations and making good calculations. So when Bowditch actually, the first time he goes to sea, he doesn't go as a first mate. He doesn't even go as a second mate. He goes as a clerk. Officially, it's not his job to do these observations or calculations. But of course, he does them, being Bowditch, and he spends a good part of his log critiquing the first mate, saying, this guy's numbers stink, and it's because he's drinking all the time. So Bowditch just loves this. But yeah, they hit it spot on, going through some of the most dangerous oceans and untracked oceans in the world.
That's just incredible. For a final question, can you tell us what's next for you now that we've got Bowditch in paperback? What are you working on now?
Oh, well, I'm on a new project about terrestrial and celestial globes, which in the 18th century were very different from what they are now. They were not just, if we take the terrestrial globe, it was not just a spherical map. It had attachments to it that allowed you to calculate time and space This was something called the use of the globes. And my hypothesis is that when people began to think globally in the 18th century, they were very much influenced by their literally hands-on experiences with these physical objects, the celestial and the terrestrial globe. So that's what I'm working on now, and it's great fun.
Well,
And
I'm so glad I asked.
of course, own globes.
Yeah, no, that sounds really exciting, and I feel like we are all waiting with bated breath to see the result. So I just wanted to thank you so much for your sharing your knowledge with us tonight and taking the time to speak to us. And I wanted to thank all of our participants tonight for spending part of their evening with us as well. And media sponsorship for this evening's event is, as always, generously provided by Novation Media. So if you will, please join us on Thursday, April 29th, so next Thursday, to learn about U-boats, Nantucket, and World War II. Programs such as this one are made possible thanks to the support of our members. So if you are not a member, please do consider joining us by heading to nha.org/membership. Thank you so much and have a good night.